The FDA and CDC have seen early signs of a possible linkage between the Pfizer bivalent COVID shot and strokes. Reuters reports that a U.S. health safety monitoring system flagged that adults 65 and older were more likely to suffer an ischemic stroke in the first 21 days after receiving Pfizer and BioNTech's updated COVID-19 booster than during days 22 to 24.
Meanwhile, over at the World Economic Forum's meeting in Davos, Moderna CEO Stephanie Bancel criticized countries that had scientific, political, and public debate about the safety of COVID-19 vaccines. Let's listen.
The extent of this misinformation when it comes to vaccination, I think has, somebody who works in the media, I mean, that was just overwhelming to see all of that across all the channels, right?
Yes, and I exactly agree with panelists, which is, I think, in some countries, you saw scientific debate in national TV at prime time. So you can imagine how people were scared. Ben has said, a lot of political debate in some countries, and the US was kind of maybe one of the worst places in the world. And you saw the differences of countries where all the parties would say, this has been approved by the regulators, clinical studies have been done, you should get your vaccines and so on. And then, as Seth said, the social media was just terrible. And so at a time of uncertainty where people were scared for their loved ones, many people, locked downs, it was very hard for everybody from a just mental health standpoint. When you couple this with all that environment, you could see some countries where you had scientific debate and political debate and social media, if you had those three things, the vaccine rate very, very low.
Absolutely.
That goes to what I've been saying about the World Economic Forum and how they are centering disinformation as this major crisis. That really speaks to that anger on display there, that you were able to share criticism or have criticism of vaccines and vaccines policy on social media. Now, obviously, there are a lot of untrue things that have been said about vaccines on social media. There is some danger out there, don't get me wrong at all. But some criticism, certainly of the policies around requiring them, is certainly merited. And frankly, it should be acceptable to debate who really needs it and who should get it. And to that point, we're seeing reporting from Reuters raising questions about the bivalent shot, which we discussed last week. There's some question about whether it's really whether it's effective versus just the booster that was available prior to that. And then and this is actually scary because this is saying a stroke risk for older people, which is who you would actually want, given that they're already at risk of a bad COVID outcome. That was the group we've been saying, they're really the ones where the calculation for getting the vaccine or getting boosted a lot is more in favor of that because they're so at risk from COVID, unlike younger people. But now they're saying a possible risk to that age group of the bivalent itself.
Yeah, so the story we talked about last week with these bivalent boosters was all about the fact that people in the scientific community, I believe at the CDC, were frustrated that certain risks associated with them hadn't been disclosed earlier. That combined with the fact that the government spent, $5 billion on these new bivalent vaccines, and they didn't actually have the intended effect of being more useful against the current variants, all meant that it seemed like a new thing that didn't do what it was supposed to do, that had risk factors that weren't disclosed, and the government spent a lot of money on it. So that was last week's story. It causes
you a day of soreness and possible fatigue and maybe missing work or something.
And now this week, the idea that not only is all of those things wrong with the vaccine, but that they might also have this increased risk of stroke. And again, we don't have numbers about how much bigger this risk is. It might not be significant in terms of the decision making here. But given that we have an alternative, you're right. This is a risk. This is a highly risk group of people over 65, people who the scientific community recommends getting boosted to protect them from even worse outcomes from COVID. But this isn't an all or nothing proposition. This is, should we use the earlier iterations of the booster, or should we use this new bivalent vaccine? And I think people need to start asking more questions about the lobbying efforts various pharmaceutical companies are pursuing in order to get the government to buy these enormous and very expensive contracts when we already have things that already exist and fulfill those needs.
Should we consider prior infection? Prior infection, and a lot of medical experts say this too, counts as one shot, essentially. So if you're an older person and you've had the vaccine and you've already had COVID and you've had one booster, maybe you don't. I'm not saying that's a good idea. I'm saying that might be something to consider of whether then also getting the bivalent is necessary.
Sure, but just presumably in the context of this story, just talking about whether or not this new bivalent booster should have been recommended.
Yeah.
There are plenty of people who haven't had a prior infection or haven't had one in over a year and need to get boosted. So the issue is,
Well, maybe you recommend it to them, but I'm saying there's no. We don't talk about these things differently.
Sure, but why this booster and not another booster?
Yeah.
Why is there this duplicity happening? These duplicates coming out of our market?
Because they really want to rush this one to market. Yeah.
At the same time that the left conversation. This comes back to the Twitter files. Yeah. Leftists who are advocating for making these things available all around the world, so that we don't have new variants emerging in parts of the world where they have no protection against this thing, were suppressed on Twitter. I mean, all of this comes back to the pharmaceutical industry pursuing profit at the expense of the actual health and welfare of the American people, and at great cost to the American taxpayer. And
health bureaucrats and the companies and bureaucrats in health agencies pressuring social media companies to crack down on any dissent on any of the points we're raising.
Yeah, although
including the points for Pfizer's bottom line, as you pointed out. They cracked down on activists who wanted exactly what you just said to happen.
I'm just trying to really focus on what started this, though, because as the story we covered last week said, scientists at the CDC were frustrated that they had information misrepresented to them by the pharmaceutical companies. So sometimes, CDC is going to make mistakes, but we can fire the CDC and the mistakes are still going to get made because the pharmaceutical companies are there promoting the misinformation in the first place. And I think we got to cut the hydra's head off, at the root. I'm mixing 1,000 metaphors, but you get what I'm trying to say.
It was, but very interesting, very bold of them to be complaining so much about all the disinformation at Davos.
Yeah.
They don't want scrutiny. They don't want criticism.
Absolutely.
All right, that does it for us today and for the week. Tomorrow on Rising, you can catch highlights of the week's best segments, and we will be back with you here in the studio next week.
Be sure to like, share, and subscribe so you never miss any content. And for those of you who like to listen while on the go, we are now available anywhere you listen to podcasts. We're also available on Roku and other streaming services, so catch us there as well. See you next week.
Take care.